Welcome to the launch for the inaugural issue of Transcripts, the interdisciplinary journal in the humanities and social sciences at UC Irvine. I have the privilege of introducing our two very distinguished speakers today who have agreed to join us and present their work, Professors Etienne Balibar and David Dale Goldberg. After our two speakers have delivered their papers, we'll open up the floor to questions. Our first speaker, Professor Etienne Balibar, graduated from the Sorbonne in Paris and later took his PhD from the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. That's pronounced that right. He is now Emeritus Professor of Moral and Political Philosophy at the University of Paris-Nanterre and Distinguished Professor of Humanities at UC Irvine. He's the author or co-author of the following books: Reading Capital with Louise Althusser, Race, Nation, and Class, Ambiguous Identities with Emmanuel Wallerstein, Masses, Classes, Ideas, Studies on Politics and Philosophy Before and After Marx, The Philosophy of Marx, Spinoza and Politics, Politics and the Other Scene, and We, the People of Europe, Reflections on Transnational Citizenship. Forthcoming in English are his Wellick Library Lectures at UC Irvine from 1996, and an expanded version entitled Violence and Civility. His past and current research subjects include philosophical anthropology, the subject and the citizen, extreme violence and the problem of civility, politics as war and war as politics, individuality and trans-individuality, borders and the representation of the stranger, and universalism and cosmopolitics. The paper he's giving today is entitled The Genealogical Scheme, Race or Culture. Professor Balibar.
Thank you, Jen. I'm very honored to have been asked to contribute, together with my longtime friend and colleague David Dale Goldberg, a presentation for the launching ceremony of the new online journal Transcript, created by students from the Schools of Humanities and the Social Sciences in this university. I'm very pleased to do it, and I want first to congratulate our young comrades for this brilliant initiative. I'm sure that it will bring a whole range of new possibilities for inventing, reflecting, and exchanging both among the students themselves and with the more seasoned scholars like us. We need fresh air, fresh challenges across campus and in relation with other universities in the world. I wish the journal a long and fruitful activity. Given that the topic of its first inaugural issue is race, theories, identities, intersections, histories, and post-racial society, I thought that I could seize the occasion to summarize some working hypotheses to which I was led in the course of revising and rectifying what I had proposed in earlier essays concerning the relationship between nationalism and racism in modern societies, at a time when the discussion was more about the emergence of a new racism, also sometimes labeled cultural racism or even racism without races, than about the so-called post-racial society, which is sometimes identified with and sometimes distinguished from multiculturalism. Indeed, the very articulation of all these terms is at stake here more than ever in our discussions. They have an immediate political import, but they also call for a broader historical and discursive analysis, which was my second reason to organize my remarks around the category of the genealogical scheme, thus trying to connect from a different angle with the question on which I teach my class this year in the critical theory emphasis program, namely bourgeois universality and anthropological differences. I will organize my presentation in two parts of unequal length, but trying to keep a certain balance of the diverse perspectives with which I am now working. I would start with relatively quick self-referential indications concerning the notion of the fictitious ethnicity that I had been proposing earlier, and the use that some more recent scholars have made of it. Then I will summarily discuss some models of the genealogical scheme that I believe to be able to borrow from philosophy, literature, anthropology, and history, which hopefully will allow me in the end to add some quick remarks about the political relevance of this idea. In a book called Race, Nation, Class, Ambiguous Identities that we so generously referred to, which I wrote in collaboration with Emmanuel Wallerstein, each of us contributing his own chapters, published in France in 1988 and then in Britain in 1991, and also in some later essays, I had embarked on analyses of what I considered in a broad sense to form the preliminaries for an anthropology of the nation form in modern times, involving at the same time a description of a model of subjectivity that could be called homo nationalis, and a reflection on a great institutional equation which governs the political in modern times, namely that of nationality and citizenship, providing the construction of subjects with a condition at the same time inevitable and highly unstable, not to say contradictory, or inevitably challenged and disrupted from the inside. This was supposed in particular to help us understand how, in the wake of the constitution of nations, in the bourgeois sense, through revolutions, processes of unity or unification, and independences of different kinds, but always involving a popular participation and consent, a certain community effect was produced and maintained, where racism was not a contingent addition, but rather a necessary internal supplement, the phrase I used on this occasion. This was not a way of simply identifying racism and nationalism, or even to pretend that in any conjuncture among any political camps in bourgeois society, rampant or aggressive racism would inevitably follow from nationalism, but rather of explaining why, when the nation form becomes challenged and undergoes crisis, which happens throughout its history, the development of racist ideologies and practices appear as a natural solution which indeed essentially aggravates the crisis, not only at an intellectual or strategic level controlled by the state, but also at a popular and social level. In this perspective, I coined the notions of fictitious ethnicity, which I defined roughly as the transformation of the idea or the ideal of the nation into a representation of natural community based either on race or language or both. And the second notion, generational connection, suggesting in particular that the nation must find a mechanism, both institutional and imaginary, to transfer and reproduce at the political level the symbolic function, binding successive generations with one another, carrying identities and norms. These ideas were invoked then with qualifications and critical transformations by some scholars, in particular feminist philosophers and anthropologists, working on the notion of reproduction by taking into account and, in fact, pitting against one another both the socio-economic meaning and the biopolitical meaning of that term, reproduction. This was particularly the case with Alice Eve Weinbaum in the United States and Rada Ivekovic in Europe. Weinbaum, in her book Wayward Reproductions, would emphasize that the fictitious ethnicity of the nation is in fact a genealogical or quasi-genealogical order, and that within such an order, relationships of domination based either on race or gender are mutual prerequisites. Ivekovic, in her book Le Sexe de la Nation, the nation's gender or even the nation's sex, would quote my phrase, I quote, "It is an essential aspect in nations that they configure time through instituting the connection of generations." But then she would add, the connection of generations is inevitably mediated by the biopolitical processes of the reproduction of the human or the species. And therefore, when the nation materially institutes the connection of generations, it imposes violent forms of partition and exclusions, Some genealogies are allowed or even prescribed, others are forbidden, destroyed, disavowed, or repressed. Referring to my idea that the nation constituting itself as a political state, nevertheless, and perhaps contradictorily, models itself on the family in order to define its internal order, she would assert that the nation, qua political institution, is never neutral but entirely sexed, never neutral with respect to gender, but entirely sexed, relying on a structural division of statuses for men and women, and more than that, is an institution where the subjection of women forms the model of every other discrimination. This brings back a hypothesis that I had myself quickly enunciated in a different place. The racist community and the sexist community, or if you prefer, the community of males excluding women, are not really different, excluding women from power, are not really different. They are, in fact, the same community, or they rely on the same community effect. However, such radical formulations, which I believe hit the right target, leave some problems unclear. There remains a deep uncertainty concerning the articulation of the nation form and the institution of the family, or, if you prefer, the two orders, public and private. Is this an analogy, an extension, or an incorporation? And there remains a difficulty to understand the political ambivalence of effects produced by concrete forms of articulation of sexual relations, race relations, or processes of racialization and the political institution itself. I was particularly thinking of highly ambivalent forms of combination of racism and sexism, both on the side of the dominant society and the dominated or excluded groups, as were highlighted by the conflicts and struggles in the ethnic ghettos, such as the French banlieue, made famous by the 2005 uprisings. In resistances against racism and a racialized model of the nation, what you witness is a volatile combination of movements of women's liberation and movements for the appropriation or reappropriation of women by males, for which the liberal Republican state appears as a threat. We cannot ignore the ultra-violent double bind in which immigrants and children of migrants are taken, with on one side a prohibited genealogy and on the other side a stigma of origin or ethnic cultural descent that is imposed on them, so that the normalization of family life, which already in general becomes increasingly problematic in today's society, is made an impossible goal. Such theoretical conversations and political dilemmas of the conjuncture prompted me to try and return to the general issue through the detour of reflecting on the genealogical scheme itself, which seems to be at work and also held in check in the vicissitudes of the nation form. I had found the expression genealogical scheme, I don't say he invented it actually, used by Jacques Derrida, who makes use of it in particular in his book Politics of Friendship, when particularly he proposes a deconstruction of the concept of the political or the political model of democracy, inasmuch as in our Western tradition it involves not only a reference to liberty and equality, but also to fraternity or brotherhood among the citizens. This, he suggests, cannot take the form of a genealogy of concepts alone, unless reciprocally the very notion of genealogy as a critical operation of the intelligence becomes questioned. I refer you particularly to a passage on page 105 of the latest paperback edition of Derrida's Politics of Friendship, which I am not going to read entirely, of course it would be too long. Let me just pick up there this phrase. At stake would these three phrases. At stake would thus be a deconstruction of the genealogical schema, a paradoxical deconstruction, a deconstruction at once genealogical and agenealogical of the genealogical. It would concern by way of a privilege granted, thus its attribute, the genealogical, wherever it commends in the name of birth, of naturalness, which has never been what it was said to be. It would concern confidence, credit, credence, doxa or eudoxia, opinion or right opinion, the approbation given to filiation at birth and at the origin, to generation, to the familiarity of the family, to the proximity of the neighbor, to what axioms too quickly inscribed under, axioms too quickly inscribed under these works, etc. You see, it's a very broad perspective. In the wake of this idea, of this proposal, I want to try and see if I can use such a notion, genealogical schema or genealogical scheme, in order to problematize the appearance, at the same time massive and enigmatic, that the political in its modern bourgeois form, namely the nation, does not so much eliminate the genealogies than displace and generalize them. I want in particular to draw a somewhat fine line of demarcation between the idea of a genealogical scheme and such apparently very closely related notions as a genealogical principle of the symbolic order, which in France has been particularly emphasized by post-Lacanian thinkers who are also defending the traditional notion of the law with psychoanalytic arguments like Pierre Lejean, remarkable. I think that what is at stake primarily here is in fact not so much a symbolic order whose foundations should be looked for in a metapsychology of the unconscious origins of civilization, or a metaphysics of right and law which transposes theological categories into democratic representations of sovereignty. Then it is made of material institutional structures, and there I draw on Foucault and Althusser as much as on Derrida. However, these are structures which, over a very long time, probably preceding and surviving the classical nation-state, perform a quasi-transcendental function inasmuch as they make it possible to articulate the individual or the individuality of the subject with a representation of the genre and the generic dimension of the human. Note, please, note in passing that all these terms, the genre and the gender, the generic, the genetic, the genealogy and the genealogical, share the same etymology coming from either, it's in fact the same word, Latin genus or Greek genos, which is not to say, of course, that they all use it in the same way. And while inscribing the individual in the horizon of the genre, which you can consider a universalistic operation, they also make it possible to articulate identities with belongings and memberships, which can be, of course, exclusive or non-exclusive, just as the articulation can be one of identifications or one of rebellion and, in fact, simply distanciation. This correlative operation does not so much invoke a universalistic horizon than a construction of the community, including the community of citizens, which, as we know, was always the aphoretic question that political philosophy and political discourse in the West tried to resolve. With regret, I do not embark here into the consideration of many literary examples, without which I believe that, in fact, such conceptual riddles are definitely not to be explored and understood. I will only refer to one example. There's barely any great Western novel in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially a great realist or modernist novel that is not concerned with the institution and the subjective issues of genealogy, and so to speak, its permanent crisis or its inevitable failure in the possible form of its more or less apparent triumph. Let me refer today, and very quickly, which is a shame in a sense, to Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, published in 1936 in the middle of the New Deal era. As you remember, the secret reason for the murder which destroys the Substance estate and the lives of the whole family, which were explained through the complex monologues of the characters, is rooted in the traumatic actions both suffered first and performed then by the father, and then carried over to his two sons, Henry and Charles, remains partially undecided at the end. It oscillates between two logics: that of miscegenation, expressing a code of racial differences, and that of incest, since Charles is the half-brother of Judith and Henry, son to Henry Sutton from a previous marriage, which he has broken or dissolved himself when discovering that his wife was in fact black, that is, had inherited from her ancestors a racial stigma which in her son has, of course, become invisible, but therefore all the more unacceptable. Given Sutton's own conduct, which in the end leads to the degeneracy of his race, it seems nevertheless likely that the dogma, so to speak, whose observation leads to the catastrophe, is more on the side of racial miscegenation than of family incest, or even that the second is seen as a remedy against the first in a delirant manner. It is this nexus that we can try and combine with the political question. What does Faulkner's novel illustrate? Is it the idea, post-colonial ante litteram, that the colonial situation, more precisely the situation of internal colonization of the American South, would anticipate a bourgeois order in which ultimately questions of degeneracy, inherited defects, eugenics would entirely invade questions of or problems of ancestry, descent, lineage, thus making the progeny more decisive than the ancestors? Or is it Faulkner who, in an allegoric manner, would have projected such typically bourgeois obsessions or fantasies into a mythical colonial past in order to have the individual tragedy symbolize the collective one, the violent destruction of the colony itself during the Civil War, appearing as now as the backlash of its own internal violence? In any case, the novel also offers an extraordinary treatment of the articulation of alliance and inheritance, and the way they are thrown into crisis when the foreign body par excellence, that is the racial other who had remained invisible, emerges in the middle of the generational connection. The real work of investigation and problematization should indeed start now. I will only indicate how I believe it could become oriented. A very long, perhaps infinite anthropological detour would be needed, this time using the name anthropology in its disciplinary sense, that is, submitting our use of anthropological work to the critical supervision of the professional anthropologists themselves, and a no less substantial detour through the history or the genealogy of the notion of race in its many contradictory uses throughout modernity would be equally necessary. Post-colonial studies and anthropology have completely transformed our understanding of the way race and sex, qua differences, are articulated, and what kind of power relations, discriminations, real and imaginary subjection, violent exclusion and violent inclusion they support, in particular as it unravels the traces that slavery and imperialism have left in the post-colonial societies, and especially influence the self-consciousness or self-representation of nations which do not cease to perceive themselves as embodying universal values in their constitutions. Many of the analyses here were carried on by women anthropologists. I will give only Anne Stoller as an example, but of course not only. There are, however, several points which remain enigmatic in my view. There's a question in particular of what makes the specificity of slavery and its social, affective, intellectual, political traces in countries like the United States, where the nexus of trauma and cultural productivity is especially visible within the general framework of colonization and empire. Conversely, this is the question of why we cannot read the history of colonization as a protracted geopolitical phenomenon, as a simple extension, or pushing to the extreme of the phenomenon of slavery, especially chattel slavery, even if we agree that colonization and empire are the framework inside which modern slavery was justified and expanded. This is in particular where such analyses as those of French anthropologist Claude Meillassoux which in his Anthropology of Slavery appear to me particularly valuable, because he would insist on the importance of the genealogical interruption in the process of the production of slaves, slave populations. Slaves violently uprooted from Africa and transported to America have neither ancestors nor progeny, except the products of the operations of reproduction compared to that of domestic animals, or the effect, so to speak, of the sexual pleasure that the white master takes with his female slaves. I tend to believe, but this is only a hypothesis, or not even a hypothesis, a simple guess, that the phenomenology of the presence of the foreign body, the intruder in the middle of the bourgeois order, whose essential manifestation is the racialized body in terms of color, derives not so much from a coherence of the sexual and racial dimension, either formulated in biological or cultural languages, than from the invisible disruption or interruption within the genealogical scheme that slavery in particular has pushed to the extreme and installed in the very heart of the collective memory of our institutions. There would be indeed many other aspects of the transition from colonial societies with their complex regimes of racial and sexual domination to the so-called hybrid societies of the former metropolises, where the competition among men for the control reuses the services of women is never to be observed independent of racial and or cultural characterization of the subjects, both among the dominant and the dominated, the rich and the poor, etc., to try and decide where the genealogical scheme is operating and how it becomes instrumentalized in the very moment when its continuity, its social function, its legitimacy are increasingly difficult to ascertain. Now, the form in which the genealogical scheme was purified and emphasized in Western history was certainly above all its inventing and progressively generalizing the notion of race between, say, roughly the 16th and the 20th century, before it was officially disqualified by scientific and political institutions, speaking in the name precisely of the Universal UNESCO in particular. Perhaps only to continue a subterranean life under different names, such as cultural tradition or membership, and more interestingly, becoming vindicated by individuals and groups stigmatized as cultural or ethnic others who insist not on the elimination of the name race, but rather on its performative reversal, for which the famous "Black is beautiful" remains emblematic. Because they don't want the problem of hereditary exclusion, generation after generation, father to son and mothers to daughters, to become cancelled and occulted with the name that originally made the exclusion possible and even legitimate. This is why I also believe that we should continue to study the immensely complex history or genealogy of the category race and all its metonymies, blood, color, drives, etc., and develop our understanding of the functions that it has performed. Some of these functions are crucially cognitive, or if you like, epistemological, more easily said. That is, they have to do with the frameworks that were available for the human or the human individuals to understand the organization of their own species indeed always in the form of a knowledge that was inseparable from power relations. This remains very much the case today, which is perhaps one of the reasons why such substitutes of racial relations as multiculturalism are a permanent stake in scientific debates as they are indeed in political conflicts. The naturalistic paradigm of the understanding of the history, diversity, separations and hybridations of social groups has been replaced tendentially with the sociological and cultural paradigm, which does not produce, of course, exactly the same effects of recognition and misrecognition. I'm not claiming that, but which must also combine a representation of the spatial and territorial distribution of the humans with an integration of their diversity into a single history or a single time, which the West has mainly imagined as linear progress, but which we are learning progressively now to imagining and conceptualizing in more complex and less polarized manners. However, some of these functions are also linked to the question of understanding how anthropological hierarchies are inherited or transferred from one generation to the other, and how these mechanisms of transference have been linked with reproductive institutions, and finally, how they have become progressively altered in the processes of colonization and decolonization. It seems to me that the vicissitudes of the category of race are a good guiding thread to enter into the field of these complex transformations. In a recurrent manner, the question has been asked whether there exists really something like a racism without races, and in which sense, whether it is a racism or a genuine racism or a symptom of the declining significance of race, to quote a well-known American sociologist, that is Julius Wilson, which relations it has with the various forms of identity politics, which clearly are not distributed only on one side of the existing, essentially capitalist relations of power. How it could be possible to combine a universalistic critique of stigmatization and a critique of the homogenizing functions of the anti-genealogical discourse of right, law, and citizenship. Perhaps we could simply suggest the following. In the first time, what seems to be the case is that genealogical notions included in the form of the idea of cultural including in the form of the idea of cultural legacy or inherited identity, and more generally the genealogical scheme, which covers the whole range of notions from genetics to heritage or patrimony, when it is used for identifying community or collectives, is something like the remainder of the idea of race after its application to the violent discrimination of colonial subjects or descendants of slaves or ethnic others has been delegitimized. This is essentially visible when, for example, returning to the example of the social and cultural conflicts in the modern ghettos like the French banlieue that I mentioned in the beginning, a quality like migrant, which is in fact a stigma, of course, and a pejorative collective name, becomes absurdly attributed to youngsters who, because precisely they are discriminated, are seen as a threat, but who are only the children or even the grandchildren of the actual migrants, therefore enjoy the national citizenship for most of them, so that the quality migrant becomes socially and symbolically a hereditary quality for people who do not move, do not migrate. We can see here the continuation of the representation of quasi or pseudo-collective genealogies that I referred to as a community effect. It shows that the community as such cannot become universalized, or it has to exclude its others from the universal itself. But if we take a second look at this absurd mechanism, we can also understand that in a sense the name race, whatever the biological justifications that were found for it, deriving from the transformation of natural history and evolutionary biology into what my master Georges Canguilhem called the scientific ideology, was never anything else than a myth, more precisely, a mythical construction, allowing it to imagine that reproduction, transmission, education, memory, tradition, etc., are taking place within the limits of a community bearing a certain recognizable identity. Indeed, this myth was anything but deprived of effectiveness, which is the characteristic of all genuine mythical construction. It was applied and forced into reality, so to speak. With this idea, we can finally, end with this, finally return to the idea that there is an intrinsic link between racism and sexism that the modern nation not only does not suppress, but permanently reinforces, while it is bound in the end to produce permanent crises of its institutional life. The concept of race does indeed immediately exhibit the sexed character of every social mechanism of transmission of properties or capacities from one generation to the other. And it illustrates, in a sense, the powerful fantasy of reproduction as an iteration of the same, for which, paradoxically, you need at least two individuals who are always already dissimilar, which in turn leads to all sorts of practical and imaginary methods to prevent reproduction from generating otherness. Indeed, I have in mind here Philomena Essed's extraordinary notion and investigation of what she calls preference for sameness as a rationale of everyday racism. But this pragmatic concept of race also possibly transferred to culture with the genealogical scheme itself calls probably for more which we know has murderous effects, namely the idea that nations or groups of nations sharing what is sometimes called a civilization should be considered as endogamic communities, where reproduction is normally organized as a redoubled alliance of its own members. As we know, this was never the case, neither in the colonies nor in the metropolises, and it is less than ever the case today, in spite of all the powerful mechanisms of resistance to hybridation or miscegenation, quote unquote, both on the side of the dominant and the dominated communities within our globalized society. So reproduction was always governed not by the application, but always by the transgression of its own law. What existed was not endogamy, it was a kind of pseudo-endogamy. But pseudo-endogamy is not the same as random or generalized hybridation. As the ideals of post-racial societies, multicultural communities, diasporic territories become increasingly influential at the political level, it is of course imaginable, other social factors being indeed taken into account, that the genealogical scheme will be increasingly disrupted, or if you like, practically dismantled or deconstructed. I hardly believe that it will be entirely dispensed of, even in its transgressive or provocative uses, as long as no other notions are to be found, or dominant notions are to be found, to articulate collective history and individual reproduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Our next speaker is Professor David Theo Goldberg, who is the director of the system-wide University of California Humanities Research Institute and executive director of the MacArthur UPI Research Hub in Digital Media and Learning. The latter is the international center coordinating all research for the MacArthur Foundation Initiative in Connected Learning. He is a professor in comparative literature and criminology, law, and society, and an affiliate professor of anthropology at UC Irvine. He has written extensively on digital media's impact on higher education, race and racism, law and society, and critical theory. His most recent books include The Threat of Race, Reflections on Racial Neoliberalism, and with Kathy Davidson, The Future of Thinking, Learning Institutions in a Digital Age. His paper is entitled Remains and Refrains, The Rattle of the Post-Racial. Professor Goldberg.
Okay, there's a common conception that the post-racial, the very notion of the post-racial, starts depending who you look at. When Barack Obama gets elected, I mean, if you Google post-racial, almost invariably, not exclusively, but very largely, it'll bring up a reference to Obama, right? Interestingly enough, and very little else beyond that. So there's a moment of a kind of faux initiation of the post-racial with Obama's election selection, to quote Etienne from a different set of music. But of course, there's a much longer, at least a 50-year-old kind of genealogy you can point to the post-racial, if not a lot longer than that. So you can trace the post-racial to the kind of post-war, I mean, Etienne mentioned the UN Statements on Race, starting in 1947, 1948, and reiterating themselves into the 1950s. You can trace it to the conception of the critique of race that comes out of the biological conception of race that comes out of those statements, or of course to the commitment to a post-war and increasingly civil rights conception of colorblindness, of non-racialism in South Africa that you find articulated in the Freedom Charter of 1955, 1956. I mean, all of these are, in a sense, precursors of a notion of the post-racial, and increasingly, more recently, the growing connectivity of everywhere that has come to be marked by the conception of globalization, of traveling concepts, local inflections and instantiations. And so I think all of this is a background to the post-racial. And even further back, you can, the distinction that I've marked in earlier work between racial naturalism and racial historicism. Naturalism, the inherent inferiority claim, in short. Historicism, the historical immaturity claim. You can argue that the post-racial is a kind of extension of the historical immaturity claim, in some sense. I mean, that's a deeper sort of a claim that I'm not going to spend time articulating here, but I think it's connected. So you can ask how the post-racial is then connected more recently to the genealogy of neoliberalism. And of course, if you think of neoliberalism, and this is very truncated, of neoliberalism as the emphasis on privatization, the emphasis on individualism and individualization, the emphasis on flows of goods and services, of capital, human and financial, that you can ask how the post-racial is connected to this set of ideas, and I want to mention just one strand of that connection. There are others, but this is one I want to stress because I want to come back to it, and that is thinking in The Birth of Biopolitics to Foucault's emphasis on the notion for the conception of the neoliberal of the man of enterprise. Right? The man of enterprise is the man of self-making, the man of making things and making himself up, right, as he makes those things. And it's that sense of make-up, of making it up, of a kind of fabrication that I think deeply connects this notion of the post-racial, as I've come to articulate a bit more thickly, with the notion of the neoliberal. So here are a series of somewhat disparate reflections on the conception of the post-racial. The post-racial empties out the conventional racial of its classic meanings, at once opening the racial in its empty silences to be filled with any meanings chosen. At hand, fabricated. This filling becomes a fulfilling of prophecy, predication of what is divine, always already known, about history, personality, productivity, national character, in a sense, national personality, not ready in some claims for democracy, for example. I mean, they claim about, other places and other times. Here, Glenn Black's history lessons are exemplary as to his make-believe claims about Egyptian events these past 3 weeks. Right, so many of you would have seen the his claim that the popular uprising is fashioned by socialists and Islamists looking to establish a caliphate throughout the region. Right? So post-raciality, in this sense, is pure political theology. The racial silent, the silently racial, its ghostly presence burying alive racial histories, is a perfect medium for what I've called make-believe, of compelling belief in the unbelievable, the unseen truth inscribed yet again in socialities of the skin, now presumed without naming because they no longer have to be named, evidenced experientially as communities of experience, but lacking independent warrant, asserted shamelessly because absent the apparent cover of classic racial terms. Post-raciality then becomes a deflection particularly from attending to racial disparity. Invisible man becomes invisible condition, the condition of preferred invisibility, often spelling itself out as a kind of spectacularity, as we've seen again and again and again. I won't elaborate this, but open to discussion. This deflection enables the assertion of the racial in its social conditions and conditionality without calling attention to the raciality of its condition. Israel in Palestine, the perfect case in point. So racism expresses itself in the extreme because delinked from the constraints of its being named as racial injustice. The avoidances of racial reference, of being named in and on these terms, being named as pariah condition precisely, evidences the lengths to which folk history, privileged folks asserting privilege while claiming disprivilege, ruling folks, will go to purge themselves, to deflect the taint. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I don't intend it, or I didn't intend it. We are a nation of laws. We stand for justice. Given our history, how dare you suggest, etc., etc., etc. So the post-racial is not simply a racism without race, as Etienne referred to, or racism without racists, somebody like Eduardo Bonilla Silva. But as I write in The Thread of Race, racisms without, you might say, racism. This enigmatic condition of the circulation of racisms, renewed, reinvented, resurrected, born again, though never dead, without the terms to name it as such, to identify, comprehend, or condemn. We could even call this the avatar condition. The post-racial, then, is like the post-colonial. Not the end of race, just as the post-colonial indicated not the end of colonial effects, but a different mode or set of modes in which the racial is instantiated, lived out. So just as the post in post-colonial is not the end but the afterlife of the colonial, so too the post in post-racial. The afterlife, the ghostly haunting by the racial of the social, supposedly rid of the racial. The post-racial is the racial, a spirit condition of the social. Sociality is unnamed because unnameable spirit. I mean, its terms of naming have been taken away from it, so to speak. Structurally, post-raciality is about new markets and the new identities to support them, emanating from but exceeding any traditional mode or expression of raciality. It is a raciality that in its enigmatic drive to exceed the bounds and bonds of race, to multiply or proliferate the inputs, does so through denial. A denial not just of historical conditions, but of the contemporary constraints, the legacy of racially driven inequalities, structured by those historical conditions reproduced across time. The post-racial buries alive those very conditions that are the grounds of its own making. Buried alive, those conditions continue to constitute a hold, a handicap, a disability at the extension of race and class, are those still forced to bear their load? I think here of Arthur Quayson's work relating the racial to disability studies. Class standing mitigates and mediates the load, admitting some into a register of the privileges of whiteness, without dissolving or compensating, at least completely, for the accumulated disadvantages. But the post-racial is not just denial of lingering racial conditionality. It's discarding of the racial to the past of history. It is more than that. The post in the post-racial is a denial also about post-racial denial. Deniability is recursive refusal. I assert my racial, in this case my non-racial, post-racial innocence, not just by denying that I any longer or ever make or may racial reference or mobilized racist exclusion. I now further deny that I am in denial. I can't possibly be racist now because I never was then. My tolerance now, my openness to all otherness, is evidence of my characteristic tolerance. So I couldn't have been then too. I can't be in denial because, tolerant then as now, denial was never an issue. So post-raciality as the denial of denial. I've turned my past into an empty white canvas, perhaps even a canvas of whiteness, or better yet, a canvassing of whiteness. The post-racial as the vanishing point of race, and the supposed fading pinprick of racism. There are a couple of examples. Actually, this argument about the denial of deniability comes from a line of argumentation of Sari Makdisi, I'll refer to in just a moment, in his fabulous work on the newly emergent Jerusalem Museum of Tolerance, which I'll mention in just a moment. So two quick examples. One is South Africa's troubling treatment contemporarily of African aliens. So, I mean, some of you have seen District 9, no doubt, which troublingly problematizes the very condition. Jacob Dlamini's wonderful novel or set of ruminations called Native Nostalgia, about the nostalgia of black folk for not apartheid, but what happened in their lives under apartheid. And he references his mother's characterization now, nostalgically about her past. Today, she says, there are too many outsiders, right? I mean, so this reinscription of an insider-outsider condition, referencing back nostalgically to a life that was much simpler, even under the horrors of apartheid. One can reflect on this in greater detail. The other exactly is the Museum of Tolerance, not the one in LA, though connected to the one in LA, but the one now being proposed and probably built in Jerusalem, actually on a very old Palestinian cemetery, right, from which bodies have been excavated and thrown into dumps and so on, unidentified and so on and so forth. And you can't see this very well. The Frank Gehry building, he was supposed to have designed the building, and actually Sari Makdisi's article in Cultural Inquiry, Critical Inquiry, right? Well worth reading, maybe 6 months ago. Actually got Gehry to withdraw from the project. I mean, after he just sorry for having criticized him, but then admitted that he was wrong and actually withdrew for that and other reasons from the project. And the new design is the one on the left, which is a kind of bunker design, and actually the exhibition space is all underground, sort of mimicking the kind of underground condition of life for certain people in that part of the world. The post-racial then is also a passage to reversals of who gets charged with racism, of privilege, charging the relatively disprivileged or the insurgent with racism, a different direction to the reversibility to which Etienne referred in his talk earlier today. So the post The post-racial is a predictable elaboration of the neoliberal, or as I put it, the hyper-extenuation that is the neo-neoliberal. Through the mimetic mixtures and mixings of unleashed and unlicensed social intercourse, almost but not quite anything and everything goes. The mimetic here is the insistence that the standards, values, social conditions to be aspired to and emulated are those of the racial dominant, of whiteness as see-through condition, as social transparency itself. A transparency that allows the thick traces of racial privilege to be reached only by tracing, mimicking, you might say, dominant sensibilities. And where mimetic mixing breaks down, where rogues and rogue states break the boundaries and erase the edges of social accessibility, you get the recourse to violence. The post-racial contemporary, then, is the instantiation, the instancing of an instant recourse to the racial without second thought. It has been made, you might say, the default mode of globalization's neoliberalizing political unconscious. So the second section then is to bring all this a bit closer to home in more concrete terms, namely here. Obama is the outcome, the symbol of the post-racial. I'm almost tempted to say the avatar as well. Not the prompt or the cause. Many thought, perhaps over-optimistically, that Obama's election to the US presidency would signal that racism, and perhaps racially produced disposability in both senses, was now an historical relic in America. I'll leave you to read it. Politically active conservatives, overwhelmingly white, have seized on racial reference by more liberal political figures to advocate policy initiatives to charge that the latter are perpetuating racism. Institutional racism is deemed mere anomaly, some irresponsible outlier, the exception rather than any longer a structural condition. When occurring at all, it is supposedly the expression of wrong-headed individuals. Conservative insistence on literal colorblindness has undercut any attempts to invoke racial considerations to redress the negative effects of past discrimination. I mean, you can reiterate these kinds of instances almost ad nauseum, literally. As a consequence, racism has become less a social exclusion and humiliation of those taken to be racially different than invocation of or reference to race for social and especially governmental purpose. Any political or governmental invocation of race for conservatives amounts to racism, especially if designed to produce ameliorative or corrective outcomes in response to the pernicious burdens of past or continuing racism. Some go further, claiming that any liberal charge of racism is censorious. It doesn't matter what I say, this reads. A regular Tea Party posted, "You'll call me racist anyway," or think of Dr. Laura's diatribe aimed at that young black woman on the radio. Part of the conservative strategy here has been to place liberal political figures on the defensive regarding race. They have sought to undercut any advantage liberals might gather by revealing ongoing evidence of racial discrimination. After all, if a black man has ascended to the highest political office in the country, what further racial barriers can there be? We must be beyond racism, reduced merely to racial reference. More liberal proponents, by contrast, at least implicitly acknowledge a distinction between invoking race and expressions of racism. Underlying this distinction is the sense that to address the more pernicious and continuing legacy of racism requires racial identification of those continuing to suffer discrimination. After all, there's compelling evidence that especially African Americans, Latinos, Muslim Americans, but also to some degree Asian Americans, and of course American Indians to more than some degree, continue to face discriminatory conditions today, most notably in employment, housing, access in renting and mortgages, and loans for larger order purchases like automobiles, even after disaggregating for wealth and income differentials. The rate of unemployment for African Americans historically and contemporarily is twice that of whites, for example. It remains the case today. To document such discrimination, of course, requires racial reference. So If racial reference is taken away, then it becomes impossible actually to continue to document those considerations. I can give numerous examples of this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. Conservatives have sought to shift the grounds on which racial politics play out. They are against any explicit racial reference, most notably, but not only by the state, to extend advantages, especially to citizens who are not white. And think of Ward Conley, right, in the university, both in the California University of California case. In part, this has been done to sow seeds of doubt in the minds of so-called independent voters, largely considered white, that though they may have voted to elect Obama, he really doesn't represent their interests. And while only implicit, the innuendo is that he doesn't represent their interests exactly on racially identified grounds. He is for affirmative action, which undercuts opportunities for them. He is for extending social benefits, which means higher taxes for them. He is for regulating small business, which means more difficult lives for them. And he is for illegal immigration, or against doing anything to stem it, which makes their lives less safe. He may even be a Muslim, which makes him incorrigible, and born elsewhere, which makes him untrustworthy and presidentially ineligible. Here, Ann Coulter last week at CPAC, quote, "Obama may want to look into becoming the president of Egypt." Nobody would complain about his being a Muslim then. So note the ambiguity in this latter sentence. Nobody would complain about his being a Muslim then. Between the hypothetical and the unconditional assertion of his Muslimness. I mean, Coulter's persistent cleverness in this regard. Shifting the point of racial emphasis, putting the racial boot on the other foot, so to speak, places liberals on the defensive regarding racial matters. I mean, this is actually the cover of the thread of race, right? Colorized, as I'll come back to refer to. But the state becomes identified with the state of blackness, right? And imposing discipline on those who now are out of power. The quickness with which Shirley Sherrod was forced to step down from a government job reveals just how effective this tactic has been. But even more disturbingly, the shift, the reversibility, has also licensed the possibility for conservative whites to say pretty much anything they want regarding race. They are not now in power and take themselves literally to be in opposition, seeking to block all significant liberal-leaning legislation. Invoking race outside of governing, in civil society, in opposition to government power then, is fair game. I mean, that previous image. Hence the proliferation of racist expression in the private sphere since Obama was elected. Here, Andrew Breitbart, also at CPAC, characterizing Code Pink, Acorn, and unions. Quote, they are, he said, quote, hate-filled racist sheep. I mean, that reversibility at work again, right? Not the sort of reversal mentioned above, but a kind of turnaround is fair play. Again, lots of examples I'll pass on. The disposition on the part of more radical conservative commentators to edit remarks by black liberals especially, to evidence their criticism of supposedly inappropriate racial views, is not new. Andrew Breitbart was invoking a tried practice at least a decade and a half old. Think here of Dinesh D'Souza's The End of Racism, published 15 years ago already, it's hard to believe. Or the Willie Horton ad, Lee Atwater Unleashed, to undo the Dukakis presidential campaign in 1988. Again, you can proliferate the example. Conservatives thus has figured out a partially effective politics of race that at once speaks to their principles, places liberals on the defensive, and not only gets conservatives off the racial hook for being soft in racism, but enables them to set the terms of the racial debate, or series of debates. They can project themselves as crusaders for a colorblind America in the face of color-conscious liberals. The shift comes at a cost, though. In insisting that pernicious racist expressions are restricted to explicit invocations of race by public figures in their public function, they have licensed pervasive public expression of racist sentiment, even of the crudest variety. Sorry, that should have been this image here. It is revealing that this was the most recent thing that Breitbart issued online the other day. It is revealing that very few public conservative figures have rushed to condemn the proliferation of explicitly racist expression by whites in civil society or by conservative politicians. Think here of Haley Barbour's sort of recent troubles, right? Or for that matter, malicious editing of liberal racial reference to political ends. There's been a notable silence, exactly, because they get so much mileage out of it. Right? Far from being a thing of the past, then, racism has become reanimated as a key instrument of American politics, hardly the post-racial in that other sense. Only now in new ways and to new purposes. That the notion of race can be so easily filled with new political purpose, alas, is basic to its chameleonic and politically instrumental nature. The Republican strategy now appears, I mean, that notion of engenderment that Etienne was or engendering, that Etienne was referencing. The Republican strategy now appears to make anything Obama says or proposes the object of universal suspicion, effectively to erode the standing of the presidency, of the very office of the presidency itself. So the third and last section. If the President of the US is not immune or exempt from the orders of race, I think here of Clarence Lusain's, sorry, where am I going here? Yeah, so these are all these sort of hateful, let me just, that image. So Clarence Lusain's wonderful book, The Black History of the White House, right, which came out a couple of months ago, and I urge you to read a long history of the position and the contribution of black folk within the very structures of the White House itself, from its founding moment with the Republic. So even perhaps, especially in the name of an unnamed post-raciality, then the valence of post-raciality registers a more complicated social significance. Shelby Steele represents this retro-politics of America's post-racialism most forthrightly. Since Obama's rise to prominence, say the past 3 years or so, Steele, the neoconservative commentator, in denial of his denial, has flailed away at Obama. The figure of Steele exemplifies that in the emptying out of the racial, anything can be said in its name. Steele is to the post-Bush era what D'Souza was perhaps to the 1990s post-Reagan neoliberal moment, namely racial ressentiment in the name of racial erasure. In a much-touted book published early in the primaries, Steele predicted the impossibility of an Obama election. Obama, Steele claims, represents post-racialism in being, quote, a bargainer, basically abandoning the traditional African-American politics of challenging the white status quo. Electorally, thus, blacks would abandon him for the very reason white liberals would embrace him, namely for refusing to rub white noses in the guilt regarding historical racial injustice. Without the black vote, and with no hope of a northern black Ivy League product appealing to the white working, increasingly independent middle classes, self-aggregating in the South, Obama's candidacy would be doomed. In a hungover opinion piece the morning after Obama's election to the presidency, Steele derides Obama as a lightweight politician resorting to nothing but, quote, post-racial and post-ideological kitsch, appealing to saccharine white liberal support. Promising a post-racial society is incapable of delivering, Obama supposedly appeals to whites' need to be absolved once and for all of any racial guilt. The contradiction inherent in white support is that the appeal for them of Obama's post-racialism is implicitly prompted by racial calculation. Obama's bargain is to seduce whites to act out of racial motivation while holding out the carrot of post-racialism. But a, quote, real post-racialist, Steele insists, would reject any appeal to, quote, racial innocence, evaluating Obama strictly on the merits of his political positions. Steele reveals a key conundrum, perhaps a contradictory tenet of post-racialism. Get beyond race, treat me as individual, but only on grounds of presumed racial homogenation. What whites really want from Obama, he urges. Yes, all whites, or more generously, all whites supporting Obama. Or in an interesting slip, from all guilt-ridden to all guilty whites. I mean, the very terms that he uses, right? I mean, interesting slippage. From all guilt-ridden to all guilty whites. Right? Just as he has predicated wrongly that most all blacks would abandon him, it, quote, is not change as much as documentation of change that has already occurred. It's not change, but documentation of change that has already occurred. As evidence, certification, and recognition. Steele accordingly insists on America's principle of non-racialism, of making it strictly on individual merit, no matter the racial legacy and its lingering impacts. Yet it is not too far-fetched to presume that Steele, as in most everything else he has written, is published and read in mainstream media only and largely because he's one of the very few black voices persistently pushing this viewpoint. A view from which mainstream political pundits, in the face of dramatic demographic diversification, are desperate to find so-called credible Booker-like proponents. There's this not so very new website called Booker Rising, which is exactly what it says, a new site for, I mean, it calls itself a new site for black moderate and black conservatives, and you know, it marks itself as a black libertarian set of voices. And it engages in sort of global political commentary. I mean, even in things like in South Africa, and Zuma's remark recently about, you know, people who don't support the ANC will go to hell, and so, which caused great controversy last week in Johannesburg. Right? I mean, so they engaged in this kind of global conversation around blackness. Still evidences the post-racial contradiction. Refuse the resonance of race for all others while silently trading on its currency for self-benefit. Trash the black presidential candidate and then the black president because he holds out the ideal in his personal biography of a mild anti-racist politics. Because in the final analysis, he perhaps is a breakthrough black. Because he is black, not like me, at once black and beyond black. Still, implicitly admitting guilt of his own achievements by association in doing the bidding of a society long and very structured in racial dominance, represents a politics of post-racialism. Condemn the racially inflected and able upliftment of most all other blacks while ignoring or covering up or denying one's own, according one's personal advancement to nothing but one's own individual genius. No talented tenth here, only talented. When all others are, quote, exhausted with their suffering, that's him, exhausted with their suffering. Note exhausted with, not by their suffering. They will cease to, quote, care who the president is. I mean, interesting formulation. They will cease to care who the president is. Not cease to care about the color of the president's skin, of his racial pedigree, or not least his purity, but cease to care who the holder of the office is. At the very moment the black man, by any characterization, assumes the presidency itself becomes irrelevant. Right? I mean, following on that 1980s and 1990s critique that you saw in others. Or at least dramatically weakened, witness to the attempted re-elevation of the power of states' rights at this moment in order to draw power away from the presidency and from the Fed. The politics of neoliberalizing post-racialism, it is not too much to conclude, is the politics of playing these ambiguities, contradictions, and oppositions to overridingly personal benefit, caring less about anyone other than oneself, and those taken to be appropriately like one. Again, that notion of familiarity that Etienne was speaking about. Others don't enter into one's preference calculus, the neoliberal condition. George W. Bush pointed the way forward here. He too, after all, above all, is racially marked, silently assuming the racial power of whiteness in denial of its raciality. It is a politics of willful ignorance, of denial and the denial of denial, of disappearance and the privilege of making oneself transparent, see-through, racially unseen, unreachable, as a flip side of disposability and invisible man. Thus, long-standing, if subtly transmuting racial orders invariably shadow the post-racial, delimiting its possibilities and constraining its reach. Structurally, post-raciality keeps in place prevailing conditions of historically produced racial arrangement and power, both domestically and globally, now stripped of their historically inherited terms of recognizability. Ideologically, post-racialism does not solely absolve whites of guilt for past racisms, as Steele would want it. Rather, it erases the very histories producing the formations of racial power and privilege, burying them alive, but out of recognizable reach, thus wiping away the very conditions out of which guilt could arise. That denial of denial. No guilt because nothing recognizable to be guilty about. Post-racialism is less the kitsch of white liberal absolution, so much as the uncanny feeling that there but for good fortune go I. The uncanniness concerns the hint of misfortune, while denying its possibility, or at least denying any responsibility for it structurally, causally, or morally. The force of sustained and sustaining historical subjection is reduced to the personalizing roulette of misfortune or bad decision-making. Percival Everett, the remarkable novelist, best exploits such ironies of post-raciality, squeezing out of them their squirming asociality. In his most recent work, I Am Not Sidney Poitier, the character self-ironizingly named Everett, Percival Everett, right? So the character named Everett, who is possibly the father of the novel's principal subject, whose name is I Am Not Sidney Poitier. The actor's dead ringer, not Sidney Poitier, tells Ted Turner, the real Ted Turner, upon meeting him that, quote, I hate colorization. To which Turner deliciously responds, I have mixed feelings about it myself. The ambiguities and ambivalences of colorizing mixture and mixed feelings, the twinned underpinnings of post-raciality in denial, and recursively in denial of its denial. Obama, the phenomenon, as opposed to Obama, the actual person, is to America as the post-racial is to the racial then. Obama as phenom is expected to resolve America's, and to an extent the world's, pressing problems. I mean, think Egypt, right? And racial guilt, but America's first, as if they were unrelated, magically to make them go away through the wizardry of his words. Obama, the person, by contrast, is hobbled by the social structures of political economy set on post-raciality, making it impossible for anyone human, or to human, to make much headway. Steele derides Obama's refusal to throw in the face of whites a recitation of, quote, the history of racial injustice in America as the cowardice of, quote, the post-racial Wagner. Obama, in fact, quickly adds the necessity to recognize, quote, that so many of the disparities that exist in the African-American community today can be directly traced to inequalities passed on from an earlier generation that suffered under the brutal legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. One just has to listen sometimes to the quietness. From segregated schooling to legalized discrimination and the lack of economic opportunity. That's all about. I'm almost done. So post-racialism is reduced to reinstating a sociality of purity, only now superficially scrubbed of its explicit, pernicious turns of characterization. In its name, racisms are manufactured and manifested more silently, informally, expressions of private preference schemes rather than a formalized state policy, reproducing the given and seemingly gone. Post-racialism is in deep denial of just how, quote, phenomenologically fucked a robust mestizaje would make us, on one side, to use Alex Abramovich's apt title in his phenomenologically fucked, in his marvelously insightful review of Percival Everett's corpus, and how phenomenologically impoverished post-racialism actually leaves us on the other. You might say phenomenologically fucked twice over. In the final accounting then, Abramovich perfectly signals the blinking tensions of the post-racial condition without naming them as such. Quote, race doesn't matter except when it does. To which I add a coda, where in racial matters, the norm has long veiled itself as a series of exceptions, that too is a lingering constitutive legacy of racial exceptionism. Thank you.